Welcome back. So today we're going to get into kind of the real meat of maple syrup production and actually talking about production. So in our previous two webinars, it's been a couple weeks now, but we went over kind of the basics and getting started, history and talking about sap flow. And then we went over kind of tapping and sap collection. And now I want to go into taking that sap and turning that into actual syrup. But to do that, I want to first kind of start with thinking about kind of the sap chemistry and flavor. So understanding those components before we actually get into concentrating that sap down and then boiling it. And then we'll finish with talking a little bit about filtering and grading some syrup. And then we'll finish up in our last presentation on Wednesday, talking a little bit more about kind of bottling and finishing off our syrup. So to think about flavor a little bit more, it's important to kind of think about kind of this chemistry of maple sap. So not the maple syrup, but the actual sap. And so our finished maple syrup is 66 to 68.9% sugar, but as we've talked about in the past, that our actual sap is primarily made up of water. It's 98% water on average, generally. And so our sugars are roughly around 2% or a little less than 2%, sometimes a little above 2%. And then we have some minerals, amino acids, organic acids, these polyphenols that all are going to be in our maple syrup and help to add to that flavor as well. And so remember that at 2%, it takes about 43 parts of sap to make 1 part of actually maple syrup. And so really kind of understanding this chemistry, and we'll get into this a little bit more we're not going too far in depth in the chemistry, so don't be too worried, but it's really going to help us understand what happens when we're making maple syrup and that boiling process and where that flavor comes from. So when we're thinking about kind of maple syrup quality, and quality is certainly an important step. It is possible to make maple syrup that's not great quality, that doesn't have great flavor, and that's stuff that should not be sold in the marketplace. But if we're thinking about kind of the quality and flavor, there's kind of 3 components that I like to think about that contribute to the quality and flavor of maple syrup. And one is kind of the biological aspects, that, the trees, their growth, where they're growing, how sweet that sap is, but also other things biologically that are happening, such as changes within the tree as we progress throughout the maple season. So earlier in the maple season, we typically make the lighter grades of syrup, as we'll talk about that. And later in the season, we make darker grades of syrup. And there's some different things that go on with that, that have to do more with the sugars and that are there. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But there's also some natural changes within the tree. Some of it we don't even fully understand. But then there's things that happen even after, when the season starts to end, that when our buds start to swell, what we typically call as buddy maple syrup, because that's when the buds are swelling and starting to open, that's correlated with off flavors that get into the syrup at that time of the year, as I'll show you in a minute. And another component is the microbial aspects. So that's the quality of the sap. We'll go over some of that compounds and things that are happening in the sap that can help our flavor, but also can ruin our flavor as well. And then there's obviously the human activity of what we do in processing that sap into syrup is going to impact our quality and our flavor. So just going back to that biological aspect again. And so thinking about the buddy as later in the season, as we get, as those buds are starting to break open and swell, that the sulfur actually within maple sap starts to increase, and so that gives off flavors and to our maple sap that's happening. And so those are some of the biological activities that can happen. And then if we're thinking about microbial activity, so getting more into the microbial aspect, it's really to understand flavor, we need to understand the actual sugar composition within maple sap. And so if we're gathering pure raw maple sap that's sterile from a maple tree, all of the sugars are actually sucrose, as it comes from the tree. And sucrose is a disaccharide, which means that it's made up of two simple sugars that are joined together. So it has these kind of 2 sugar molecules, as we see in this picture here. And again, we don't have to worry about too much of the chemistry, but just knowing that we have these 2 sugars that are bonded together But some of that sugar, some of that sucrose that's there can be converted into what we call invert sugar by microbial fermentation. So when there's fermentation of those sugars, so when our sap is sitting in buckets hanging from our trees and it starts to warm up, it's been sitting there for a few hours or more, or in our tanks or traveling down our tubing lines, there's some, natural yeast primarily, or other microbes that might be in our air or in our tanks and tubing that'll start to feed on the sugars and cause some fermentation. We're not talking about, huge bubbling happening, making bread or wine or beer or anything like that, but there's some natural fermentation that's going to happen. And when those sugars ferment a little bit, the bond between those two simple sugars that make up the sucrose, that bond is broken and creates what we call in the maple industry invert sugars, or they're also called reducing sugars. And these invert sugars are really responsible for a lot of the darkening and flavor development that we get within maple syrup. So this tiny bit of fermentation is actually important. We actually want a little bit of this natural fermentation to happen within our maple sap. If not, we probably wouldn't have as much flavor in that sap or in our finished syrup if it was all 100% sucrose. Um, and so how do we get that flavor? Because again, remember maple sap, for those of you who've had sap before, it doesn't really have any flavor. It's mostly just sweetened water. So it comes through that cooking process. And so I'll show you that in a minute, but other things that kind of contribute to the flavor of maple syrup is these few different terms that I like to go over. So one, the terroir, if you've ever heard that term before, it's used in the wine industry. It's a French word that refers to the climate and the soils and the region, the culture that influences that flavor. And so we can kind of, it's a little bit of a stretch, but we can kind of say that, obviously the trees are taking up a lot of minerals from the soil, and the climate there is going to impact flavor, but also how we process it is part of that. Another one is the Meyer browning that we'll talk about, and caramelization. These are the big ones that are going to be interacting with those invert sugars. So going back to our sucrose and the fermentation caramelization. So sucrose molecule, remember it's a disaccharide. It's this has these two sugar molecules, and when it ferments, a sucrose molecule, those invert sugars that it forms, is that one sucrose molecule, when it ferments, will break into an individual glucose molecule and an individual fructose molecule. So that's that fermentation that's going to happen. And why that's really important is that it comes down to the Maillard reaction and the caramelization. So if we look at caramelization, and if you think about, we'll just focus on caramelization for right now, because I think that's the easiest to understand, that when we heat sugars, where they brown, they get that nice sweet caramel flavor. That's really part of what's happening in maple syrup. But if we look at what's the caramelization temperature of sucrose, it's about 365 degrees Fahrenheit or 185 degrees Celsius, which is pretty high temperatures. And glucose, it's not quite as high, but it's also pretty high in temperature as well. But our fructose, the caramelization temperature for that is around 219 degrees Fahrenheit or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And why that's important is because our maple syrup finishes at 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius above the boiling point of water. So thinking about Celsius, our boiling point of water is 100 degrees. So 104 degrees is right around where maple syrup is actually finishing. So if we look at our fructose, that caramelizes right at 104 degrees Celsius as well. And so fructose is where a lot of our caramelization, our flavor is going to be happening. That doesn't mean that if you get some of those sugars that hit like the bottom of a pan where there's a lot more intense direct heat, they'll get some higher temperatures. So some sucrose could get a little bit of caramelization, or some of the glucose that's here being another invert reducing sugar. But a lot of it's through the fructose. And so what this means is that as you get more fermentation more fermentation of that sucrose is going to break down into more glucose and fructose. And when you have more fructose and glucose in there, you're going to get more caramelization. You're going to get a stronger flavor. And then you're also typically going to get a darker color grade of maple syrup as well. And so that's why typically as we progress through the season, the first boil or two in the season oftentimes is a little bit dark, and then it lightens up and it stays light. And then at the end of the season, it typically gets progressively darker. And that's because usually you're dealing with warmer temperatures, and warmer temperatures is going to increase that microbial fermentation of our sucrose, give us more fructose, and will make darker syrups. And so if your sap sits around longer, more fermentation that happens, it's also potentially going to be darker syrup. And or if your tanks are dirty, your tubing's dirty, that can also contribute to more fermentation and end up with more fructose. So that's kind of an important concept to understand, some of the basics for flavoring. So just to review a little bit on caramelization, that obviously it's that browning of sugars. We need the heat for that. So it's happening with our reducing sugars, our glucose and fructose. That helps actually link some of these sugars together, that's forming within there. So that's caramelization. And then the other one, the Maillard reaction, is actually, there's probably actually more of this happening in there, but the caramelization is a little bit easier because I think most people are familiar with that. Maillard reaction, this is actually like the browning that you get on bread or even on steaks, or sausages or cookies. So people usually aren't familiar with the Maillard reaction term as much, but a lot of the food that we consume has that. And it's also a chemical reaction that's occurring with our reducing sugars and heat, but there's also amino acids that are involved with this as well. And our maple sap has a lot of amino acids. And also, typically, as our season gets later, as the sap season gets later in the season, there's usually more amino acids. And so if you get some more amino acids, there can be some more Maillard reaction happening within that's going to make some darker, stronger flavored syrups as well later in the season. So that's another reason why we get kind of different grades throughout the season, different colors throughout the year, and that it's not always the same. So it's one of the most common questions people ask about kind of some of the different grades of maple syrup. So just thinking about, I mentioned this a little bit, but can we control invert sugar? We kind of can. It doesn't always going to indicate that you're going to change the color and flavor. Oftentimes you can a little bit, but sometimes I've tried different ways of cooking it. If your sap is cooking for longer, usually it's going to make darker syrup, but sometimes we try to control that and it's going to make what it wants to make. So there's still some unique aspects of it that it's kind of, part of Mother Nature, that the syrup is going to be the grade that it wants to be. This past maple season, across the maple industry, most people were making lighter syrup, even though there was some darker, some warmer temperatures this year. The year before, most of the industry made a lot of dark syrup. It was the complete opposite. And so there's just some things that, again, we don't fully understand every single aspect, but those are some of the basics that we do understand. And so some of that weather, but also those amino acids are going to play into that. But, if you have warmer weather, warmer sap, there's going to be more fermentations, usually darker syrup. So, how long you store that sap, how long it sits around can impact that. If you're filtering it a lot, there's some dirty filters that can actually inoculate it potentially even more. If you're not cleaning your tanks often, that can have more of the microbe population build up in there that can cause more of that fermentation within that sap. One thing I will say, if your sap is sitting around a long time, that when those sugars are fermenting, they're feeding on a lot of oxygen within there, and it can become sometimes anaerobic fermentation that can happen, and that's actually not a good fermentation. If you think of anaerobic fermentation without oxygen, I like to think about that as like in pond water or swamp water. That's usually sulfur is a byproduct of that fermentation. Not very good tasting or smelling. So we want to make sure that there is some oxygen in the sap. We don't want sap to sit around too long and spoil. But if it is sitting a little while, sometimes you may want to splash it, bubble it, or even just kind of recirculate it on some kind of pump so that it can keep some oxygen in there, which is going to make darker syrup, but it'll be a healthier fermentation that's happening within that sap. So these are all kind of part of that, going back to that human activity side of things that's going to influence, and on top of other things and how we boil it, when it comes to the finished syrup, how we filter it. So we'll talk about a little bit more of that at the very end. Just wanted to hit a little bit more on storing sap, that, it's important not to let it sit around too long. And so oftentimes people don't show pictures of old nasty sap or discolored sap because they're kind of embarrassed, and so they don't take pictures of it. So I've become more fascinated with taking pictures and showing what sap can potentially be like. So this picture on the left is some really thick stuff that had sat out in a research canister longer than it should have. So it wasn't stuff that was being boiled, but you can see how it was this big slimy blob. It wasn't even soaking down into the leaves there, and the ground was nice and dry. So that was gone to the way past what we call a ropey stage, where it gets real slimy and stringy. You can actually like put your fingers on that and kind of pick it up because it's thick. Here's some green stuff, that stuff that flushes out in the middle there. That's kind of some stuff from the beginning of the season when your lines sometimes first clean out if they're not as clean, where they'll be green like that you usually want to dump, you don't want to save. Picture on the right has kind of a greenish hue to it. This is actually okay sap. It's even though it's got discoloration, sometimes this happens in sap. Sometimes it'll be greenish a little bit, not as solid green. It's just a little bit of opaqueness green. Sometimes it'll be a little bit yellow, and that can still be okay. Here's some other pictures though that are not as great. This one on the left I took, I thought it was kind of cool as an art form that was going on within here, something that had pushed to the back of the tank. And this was a lot of yeast forming. It's kind of this yellowish brown floating on top. Think of like some bread dough almost forming. That was definitely a real late season. Picture in the middle was from circulating some sap at the end of the season, late season, past making good syrup. So circulating it to keep oxygen to it. But from so much adding all that oxygen with all the yeast that was in there, we were getting some pretty serious foaming happening within that maple sap. And then this picture on the right was, again, some really thick late stuff that didn't even boil, it got dumped, but you could probably rest a coin on top of that. That's had this thick kind of film that's there. So all pretty gross stuff that you wouldn't want to boil any of this stuff. All right, so is there any questions on this flavor or any of the chemistry, that aspects with sap before we move on? Feel free to unmute yourself or throw into the Q&A or chat box. And we can move on to, and if you do have questions, obviously just go ahead and throw them in there. I can pause too throughout. So I want to move now to thinking about actually concentrating and reducing that sap down. And so obviously our process is we're going to take that sap and we're going to boil it and evaporate the water, concentrate the sugars, get the flavor in our finished syrup. But there's an initial step that before we get to the actual boiling that does not have to be done, but the industry has primarily all gone to, at least on a larger or on a commercial size operation. Not all hobby producers are doing this, but a lot of hobby producers are starting to do this more and more, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. We see more and more even smaller people who have 10, 20 trees that are using a reverse osmosis system. And so reverse osmosis, I'll explain kind of what this is a little bit, but you don't have to be a 10,000 taps or 5,000 tap operation. You can have 5 taps and still use a reverse osmosis machine. It's going to save you time, it saves you money, and it saves you a lot of energy in turning that sap into syrup. It's a different step within it. Some people like it, some people prefer not to delve into it. Some people seem a little bit daunted and think it's a little bit overwhelming. It's really not. Hopefully I'll try to break it down and explain it I don't have tons of time to go into all the details, but hopefully try to keep it as simple as possible so you can kind of understand the basics and how to use reverse osmosis, or how to that can potentially apply into your system. And we'll look at how it can save time and money. So it's different systems, such as, this bottom left one, this is a small little hobby one that has 2 membranes. That's great for, we've got 10, 20, 30 gallons of sap or so to go through. That would work really well. It's all, you can have something that small. Something like that might cost $300 to $500. Then the unit on the right would probably be somewhere around $12,000. Maybe that would work well for 3,000, 2 to 3,000 trees. The unit on the top there, that one would probably cost more like 40,000 or something like that. That's good for 8,000 trees. So there's a question in the chat, the Q&A, Darren asking, will RO change the flavor? So that's a great question that a lot of people bring up, and that's one of the reasons why people are sometimes reluctant to use an RO, is there's concern maybe that it's going to change the flavor. There has been studies done on this. The University of Vermont, Procter Maple Research Center did some controlled studies where, they process sap, same batch of sap, they split it in half. Because this is hard, you can't say that, well, we'll use the RO one day and we'll not use it another day, because that sap's going to be different each day. So taking the same batch of sap, splitting it, putting half of it through an RO and half of it just boiling on the same side-by-side, same size evaporators, and then doing kind of a 3-way blind taste test with participants, and found that there wasn't a detectable difference with the RO versus not using an RO, especially if you're only concentrating to 8-10%. I think there was occasionally some detectable differences at really high concentrations, and that was concentrating to like 30%, which takes even special ROs to do that. But it was only like, of the different times they did it throughout the season, I think it was only like detectable like once or something, so it wasn't a major difference. So it hasn't really been found to change the flavor, but it does save time and energy, so I do recommend them. I swear by reverse osmosis because I think it is a game changer. So what a reverse osmosis is doing is basically filtering out the water and concentrating the sugars down for us, doing that with a lot less energy and a lot quicker than what an evaporator can do. And so if we think about going back to our ratio of sap to syrup, so again, if we want to make a gallon of syrup, we need about 43 gallons of sap to do that if our sugar is about 2%. But if we can double the sugars and go from 2% to 4%, we actually cut the ratio in half. So by doubling the sugars, we cut the amount of water that we have to boil out in half. So now we're around 21, 22 gallons of sap to syrup. And then if we double the sugar again and go from 4 to 8%, now we take that and cut that in half. And now we're around 11 gallons of sap to 1 gallon of syrup. And, 10, we're, at that point, we're somewhere around 8.5, 9 of a sap to syrup ratio. And if we go all the way up to 20, which some operations do, this past season I have a new reverse osmosis that was going 22, 23% sugar within mine, and so my ratio is about 4 to 1, which is a lot less water that I have to remove overall. And as we can see, it is kind of, the line does start to flatten out. So as long as, once we get up to 8%, we definitely are removing more water at those higher concentrations of sugars, but it's not a significant change from the 2 to 4 or 4 to 8. And so just getting up from 2% to 4%, which is what our small ones typically do, is only remove about half. You can pass it through again and sometimes get up to 8%, but that's a big change, is going from 2% to 4%. That's half the amount of water that has to be boiled off. That's half the amount of time and half the amount of energy that has to be used for that. And another nice thing about the reverse osmosis machines is that you don't have to sit there and watch them constantly. Once it's boiling, you have to be watching that all the time in an evaporator, so that it doesn't boil over, nothing burns. The reverse osmosis, once you set it, you can walk away from it as long as you keep feeding it sap. You can go do other things, maybe just check on it every now and then. And now some of the new reverse osmosis systems are completely automated, that when your tanks fill up, it'll actually start the RO and run them. The new one that I got this past season isn't fully automated, but it is has a remote option control kind of option, so I can actually turn it on and off from my phone anywhere I have internet access. So I can be home, I can be out in the woods, and I can turn that RO. So if my tanks fill up in the middle of the night, I can look at my cameras that I have above my tanks where I can see how full the tanks are. When I see they're full, I can turn my reverse osmosis on, and it can concentrate that sap, reduce it down, so that by the time I come in the morning, it's all done and ready to go pretty much. So that is really a game changer. So what is reverse osmosis? The name sounds, maybe a little bit complicated, and it's based on the process of osmosis, which is really not that important to understand. I'm sure you've all probably learned about osmosis in high school or something, biology, and that was when water wants to move across that semi-permeable membrane to get from an area that's water that's in higher concentration of water to a lower concentration of water. So the reverse part, what's that actually mean? And so basically, when we're talking about reverse osmosis, is so in the normal osmosis, it wants to move across the membrane on its own. In reverse osmosis, we're using a pump to push it the opposite direction. So we're changing that concentration, we're changing that flow by using a pressure pump to push our feed water, or in this case, in the maple industry, we're using maple sap against that membrane, and the pure water, or what we call the permeate, will go through that membrane and will thus, the sugars, the amino acids, the minerals, everything else, and some of the water will not go through, and that's becomes concentrated into what we call the concentrate. And so with this membrane has these little tiny openings in that membrane that water molecules can fit through, but sugars and minerals, amino acids, everything else are actually larger molecules than what water molecules are. So they don't actually go through that membrane, but the water can. And so it's just the basics to think about it is it's filtering out purified water. And so if we kind of actually step back and think about what is reverse osmosis actually used for typically, and this was actually developed for creating purified drinking water on ships out in the ocean used in desalination. And so they're used in that way still. If you buy bottled water, oftentimes if it's not spring water, if you look at the source on the bottle, it may say source from reverse osmosis water or RO water. And a lot of times they add the minerals back in. They're used in laboratories for creating purified water. Even some people have them in their homes for creating purified drinking water. So in this application in maple, we want to get rid of purified water, and we want instead what's typically, in a drinking water system, the impurities, that's our sugars and minerals that we want to save. I kind of explained that. So we have all these little openings, water molecules go through, the sugars and everything else do not go through. The membrane's actually these kind of tubes that has all these layers. And so if we look at the end, we add the sap into one end around the outside. There's a tube in the middle, but it goes in around the outside. The sap feeds down through these layers and comes out the other end. The other end looks exactly the same as either end look the same. So it's coming down through one end, feeds down through all these different layers of the membrane and out the other end. But if we restrict the flow out the other end, it's going to build up pressure inside of this membrane because we're restricting flow. And so instead, some of that, because pressure is building up, you know, there's the fluid that's in there wants to go somewhere, and not all of it can go out. So the water molecules that are building up under pressure will push across the layers, so across our membranes to the pipe in the middle, and that's where our pure water can come out that pipe in the middle, because that's plumbed separately from the outside. So that's kind of the really what's actually happening in those membranes, but you really don't have to fully understand all of that, just again knowing that it's filtering out pure water. And here's just showing that reverse osmosis compared to even nanofiltration, ultrafiltration, is a very fine filtration. Water molecules are really small versus our salts and sugars, and then all of our minerals and everything else are much larger. So this is a small scale reverse osmosis machine that I actually made on parts that you can buy off of Amazon or other places online, or potentially even get at some plumbing stores. So hopefully, like, well, the backup, I guess, building this and making this little reverse osmosis, or seeing little reverse osmosis machines like this, helped me understand even more how a reverse osmosis machine actually works. When you see the large ones, they look kind of daunting, they look really complicated, and there is more going on there, but there's just kind of, there's pressure switches and more pumps and other things kind of going on, where if we just think about what's the really simple breakdown of how a reverse osmosis system works, it helps to understand even the larger components. So hopefully, if I'll walk you through this, hopefully that'll help you understand. So here's our bucket right here. This is our feed sap. So this is our sap. We have our pump that's sitting on top of this bucket, this black pump here, that's siphoning the sap out of this bucket, creating the pressure. It goes through this first housing is a this is just like a home sediment filter that you may have in your house for your drinking water system, that just has like a 10 micron or 5 micron sediment filter. That's to remove any kind of larger debris that might be in there, so it doesn't plug up your membrane. So it's just going through that filter, that coarser filter, comes out of here into the membrane. So this is actually the membrane housing that's there. It's going to go through the outside around the, as I showed in that last picture of that membrane, feeding down through, and then can come back out the other end. And so we have two hoses that come out of our membrane. Our first one is that's coming from the outside of the membrane housing, is what's going to be our sap that's just going through, the sap that goes down through the membrane, through all those layers, and pushes out the other end. Our other one is what's coming from the middle of the membrane, which would be any of the pure water that goes through the layers out the middle. And so if you notice down here, I know it's hard to see, need to get a better image of this all in operation, but this right here is a little ball valve. And so if that ball valve is completely open, the sap would just push all the way down through the filter, and there's no pressure building up, and would come out into the orange bucket only. But if I close that ball valve almost all the way, but just keep it cracked open a little bit, that's going to restrict the flow coming through there. That's going to build up pressure, and then that's going to, because it all can't come out of this pipe here, I'm restricting pressure. It's going to build up pressure. It's going to force pure water through that membrane, and it's going to come out the center pipe through this hose into our white bucket. And that's really all that reverse osmosis is doing. As we restrict that flow, it's going to build up more pressure, more water is going to be removed, and we'll concentrate our sugars even higher. The less we restrict that flow, the less water we're removing, less our sugars are being concentrated. In these small units, you can't build up too much pressure because the pump can't handle more than like 100 psi. So we don't want to build up too much pressure. Usually what you want to do is you want to match the flow. So that's these two pictures on the left is looking at the flow coming out. So they're about 50-50, but you knowing that you're removing 50% of the water. And you can then take that and run it through that. Now say we want from 2% to 4%, we could run that through a second time and remove even more water and concentrate it. So this is just visually showing some sap that I had processed on that little machine, the orange bucket being the concentrated sap. I had about 4 US gallons, and I had 5 gallons of purified permeate water that was removed. So there's a question in the Q&A from Megan: for an at-home with a small RO, what is the best goal concentration and then finish indoor? So if you can get from to 4%, that's great. If you can get up to 6 to 8%, that's a little bit better if possible. That can be harder. You're not going to get it on a single pass. Again, you don't want to build up too much pressure. So going through removing 50% of the water, so doubling it. You can go through a second time depending on the pressure your pump can handle and the membrane that you have. You may not be able to go quite as high and go from, say, if you went from 2 to 4 the first time and now you're sending the 4% through. You may not be able to go to 4 to 8. It might be too much pressure for that. So, but maybe you can go from 4 to 6, which is great. So if you can get up to 6% on a home one, that's really great point to be concentrating to. You're removing, quite a bit of water. 8%, you're at about 75% of the water has been removed, which is a huge difference. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to add more into the Q&A and I can answer more. So if using reverse osmosis, it's using a very, very small amount of electricity. It's less than a cent of electric per gallon of water that's actually removed, which is much cheaper than what you can use when you go to boil it, no matter on your source when you're boiling. So again, let's think about, as we concentrate higher, there's less water that needs to be removed when we're going to boiling that. So instead of a 40 to 1, we can get down to an 8 to 1 or a 4 to 1, which is much better on there. And so you can save a lot of energy. And so we look at our energy savings using reverse osmosis. On the left-hand side, going down, is looking at different types of evaporator fuel sources. So wood, a more airtight wood arch. The burn firebox that's more airtight, so it keeps the heat to the pans more, versus using a fuel oil evaporator, which are common in the industry, natural gas, which is less common in the industry, or even liquid propane, which is not used as often. And this is talking about in an evaporator, not in a little propane burner in your backyard. So if we're starting at 2%, this is about how much it's going to cost in fuel per gallon of syrup. So wood that's not as sealed as well, $13. A sealed arch might be around 8. And this is going to depend on, obviously it varies depending on, what your fuel costs are, whether it's fuel oil or propane or wood. And again, obviously if you have wood in your forest that you can collect, that's great. And there's maybe not a monetary cost you're handing over, but there's certainly a time cost that typically gets you pretty close to fuel oil and other sources. But if we look as we increase from 2% to 4%, removing half the amount of water, we're now cutting our cost basically in half because we've removed half of the water. And go to 8%, 10%, and all the way up even to 20%, that, if you're using even a good sealed wood arch, that our cost now per gallon of syrup instead of $8 is less than $1. And even in fuel oil, in this particular example, it's showing about $1.32. For me, this past season, I have a pretty efficient fuel oiled evaporator, plus we have our new reverse osmosis. Before we were going 16 to 18%, now we're going 22, 23% concentration. So just a little bit more water removed before we have to boil it down. And so I was using less than a quarter of a US gallon of fuel oil per gallon of syrup. So my costs were actually less than $1 per gallon of syrup and fuel oil. Versus $15, and you multiply that over a few thousand gallons of syrup that are being made, that money adds up really quickly, that you can buy a reverse osmosis system pay for itself within a year, 2, 3 years at max usually. That's just in fuel savings. If we look at our labor savings, If we base it at $20 an hour, and again, if we think more about, a lot of times as maple producers, we're doing it as kind of a side thing, as a hobby. But if you are trying to do it as a business, you should try to calculate in your time to some of this. So if you actually associate a labor cost to that, again, as we concentrate, so it is going to depend on how efficient your evaporator is. If your evaporator can produce 20 gallons of syrup an hour, versus evaporator that's only going to produce 1/10 of a gallon of syrup an hour, which is obviously going to cost a lot more. So in labor, for your 1/10 of a gallon an hour evaporator at raw sap of 2%, it's going to cost almost $200 in labor if you actually calculated that out, to make a gallon of syrup. But in that little small evaporator, if we can concentrate that up to 8%, now we're down to $50 a gallon. So we're saving 75% of our time, because we remove 75% of the water. Our more efficient evaporators, obviously don't cost quite as much in labor, but they do save over time as well. So our labor time is cut down. My evaporator, I can make about, this is in imperial gallons, I'm probably around 50 plus imperial gallons an hour, with concentrating that high. So any questions, other questions on reverse osmosis? One thing, feel free to throw in chats or unmute yourself. Just one last thing I want to mention, that I didn't say yet on reverse osmosis, is that they are great. It is an added cost, obviously, but one other piece to think about is that there is some maintenance involved in that. You don't just run the sap through and it's done. That once you run out of sap, there's still going to be sap and sugars inside the housing, or in the membrane and all your piping. And so we actually save that purified water that we filter out. And then we, right when, just like in that picture where we're sucking the maple sap out of a bucket, we instead suck the pure water through when we're done. And we actually push out all of the sugars that were in there, and we can save that and boil it, or save it and concentrate it the next day when we're running it. So we don't lose those sugars, and we also don't want those sugars to stay in the membrane, because they will, it's going to be fermentation and all the microbes that are in there. They're going to plug up your membranes. And sometimes if you're processing a lot of sap, you may have to stop even partway through and do a water flush to kind of clean up the membrane. The bigger reverse osmosis machines have different pumps that help circulate it more through there, so it doesn't plug up the membrane as much, as keeping more turbidity kind of happening. And so we want to really rinse that membrane and get it clean at the end of the day. And every so often, in the small ones and the big ones, because we're passing so much sap through, we do it typically every day, is actually do a soap wash. We're actually doing this kind of loop cycle where we're just running it through a loop back through, just to clean and kill any microbes that are in there, so it doesn't plug up our membranes. And then we want to rinse all that soap wash out. So there is a little bit of maintenance that's involved, but again, it's a lot faster than boiling that all down. So Megan asked, can I send a diagram of your my home setup of an RO? I can do that if you'd want. Would it be best, Caitlin, if I just send that on to you and you can send it on to the group, or people can reach out directly for that?
Yeah, if you have a diagram, you can send that to me, and when I send out the email with the links to the webinars, once we get them up, I can include that to all the registrants.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. So sounds great. And if you have questions about reverse osmosis systems and setup, feel free to reach out to me. I mean, any other things, but if there's things that you're not sure what you would need for your system, there's lots of different systems out there. There's ways you can make your own, and you can also buy homemade ones that are out in the market as well. And so if you got any questions, certainly reach out to me. But let's move on, and if you have more questions, we can come back to ROs if you want. But let's think a little bit more about evaporation. And this is, what a lot of people think is the exciting part, where you sit around and you drink some beer with friends or family and watch sap boil and steam come off, right? And so but it can be daunting and long, but this can be kind of the fun part and where we get our actual finished product. There's nothing better than tasting that hot maple syrup coming off the evaporator off after all the work that you've done. And so, there's lots of different ways that you can cook maple sap down, starting at the very basics of, just a pot on a stove or an open fire, or propane burner in the backyard to actual more advanced evaporators. I will say that much like within our collection buckets and tanks, everything should be food grade, and it should be stainless steel, no galvanized metal in our evaporators. You don't want lead soldered old pans. You still may find those out there, but everything should be lead free, solder free. Should be sort of stainless steel solder, if any, or stainless steel welded, more ideally. That's out there. So two different ways, kind of basic methods of actually making maple syrup and drying it off and boiling. And one method is the batch method. This is what the smallest hobbyists are going to be doing. If you're just getting started in maple or just tapping 10, 20 trees, you're probably doing more of the batch method. And the batch method is you're cooking sap down on a burner, on a fire or something like that. And as the sap level gets lower, you add in some more sap and you keep cooking and cooking. It gets lower, you add in more. So it gets all the way down and you finish it all at once into one batch of maple syrup, versus the continuous flow method, which I'll show you in a little bit, which is adding sap and kind of one end of the evaporator and drawing off the other end. And so different ways to do this where people get creative is, even just what we call the turkey fryer burner, propane burner. This does work. You're going to use a lot of propane. But if you have a reverse osmosis, and what I like to tell people that are smaller, get into maple, or before you invest money into getting a bigger evaporator or improving that more, I recommend to people to invest more in a reverse osmosis. You'll actually spend less money. A small scale hobby reverse osmosis or building your own, even if you buy one, it's going to be a lot cheaper usually than actually buying a larger evaporator. And that reverse osmosis will probably actually remove water faster than what your evaporator is going to do. So you can still make some syrup, but if you can on these propane burners efficiently, if you can get an RO and remove half the water at least, on the stovetop, this is how I started making maple syrup. It is nice if you can have a couple different pans going where you can be cooking down in one, and then you're maybe heating up some sap, reducing a little bit of water, but you're getting it hot at least. When your main big pan gets lower, you're putting in hot sap. You're not adding cold sap into there. So it continue to keep like a nice steady boil going. And one of the best, usually if you're doing a batch method, typically because you're going to be in a smaller volume at this point, is to do a stovetop finish. So getting it all pretty close to maple syrup and then put it into a smaller pot on a stove, where you can finish it off. And I guess one thing to mention is that you typically don't want to be cooking maple sap down in your house unless you have a really good vent system that vents out. So doing it on your stovetop, most of you have probably heard the horror stories of wallpaper falling off the walls from all the humidity that's put into the room and things like that. So unless you have a good vent system, I don't recommend doing it. On this stovetop, how I used to do it, had actually a good vent that vented outside, and so it worked fine. But if you're doing it outside and then once it gets close, then you can bring it inside and there's not going to be as much water coming off. So it's just like doing any normal cooking in your house. And then you can kind of regulate that heat a little bit more to finish it off in a smaller pan. And so there's even large commercial producers that have, they're not doing it maybe on a stovetop, but they have separate little finishing pans. And maybe they have a big wood fired arch, but they're drawing it off not quite at maple syrup level, but pretty close. And then they put it into like a big propane finishing pan that gets it the rest of the way, and then they can bottle from there as well. So lots of different homemade little evaporators that you can make that work more off a batch method. There's these the barrel stoves that you can make at some hardware stores or farm supply stores. You actually buy these kits that you can take a barrel and make a stove out of it. So they sell a little door kit that you can put on and a little adapter to put in the back to add a smokestack. And then you can buy these kind of hotel pans. You cut the top off a little bit and put these hotel pans on top. Old oil tanks people use. People get creative. Here's, your turkey fryer again, but this one has the feed bucket has some copper tubing going around the outside that helps warm the sap up before it goes into the pot. Here's our barrel stove again. The same thing with a bucket and some copper tubing going around the stove. That's very common as a little preheater, so the sap is a little bit warm before it comes into the pan. The cinder block stove is a very common way to start in the backyard, with even if you can make a little chimney stack in the back to get some more draw to get a hotter fire, and also keep the smoke away from the pans and you standing around it. If you are making kind of these barrel stoves, I would recommend trying to put some kind of fire brick or something in the bottom, or blanket, so that it doesn't burn through your bottom of your barrel. But also it helps actually direct that heat up instead of going out to the side and out the bottom. The heat's going up more towards the pan to redirect that. Again, your oil tank converted, and the top right is a kind of cinder block rocket stove made. Sort of works, but slow. So those are lots of different ways of people get creative in making their own little batch method homemade evaporators. And you can make even some homemade continuous flow evaporators. So the continuous flow are, again, you're adding sap typically in one side. So we're looking at this unit on the left. It has this little preheating pan in the top here that your sap's first coming into, and then it can drip down into the bottom. And then there's these dividers, and there's openings at the end. So this sap would come in here, and you can't see it in this picture, but there would be a little opening down lower in this divider. The sap would have to move across, go down this way, and then there'd be an opening down on this end of this divider, and then it would come across, and then we would draw off our finished maple syrup up in this front corner. And so as that sap cooks down and becomes more dense, it's going to naturally move to this point over here and kind of flow through. So this is less concentrated. So it's a gradient kind of coming through as it cooks. And so as this part up here gets maple syrup, we can draw that off while that part is not. And so that's the continuous flow. So instead of cooking it all down as one final batch, we're adding sap in one end, finished maple syrups coming out the other end. Not a continuous flow, or not, we're not continuously drawing off finished maple syrup, but every now and then we're drawing off depending on how efficient your evaporator is. The one on the right, just a little bit fancier, but does a similar thing where sap's coming in to this back pan. It's going to go back and forth, then into this front pan where it's going to have some dividers and draw off in the front here. And one thing I wanted to point out about this evaporator, so the arch is what we call this bottom portion. Notice how this slopes up. So your firebox here in the arch slopes up, so it really pushes that heat up close to, because your fire is going to be here, and then that heat's drawn across here and up your stack. So it gets really close, so that heat's really in close contact with the pan instead of really distributing the weight or the heat out to the side, but also gets that heat close to the box. So some parts of an evaporator, if you think about these continuous flows, a little bit more sophisticated. So this particular evaporator in this picture has a steam hood. So this helps direct the steam coming off instead of your little sugar house building up with the steam and you can't see 3 feet in front of you, or your glasses are fogging up, steaming up. It directs the heat through some exhaust pipes that go out the ceiling. There's also most likely a preheater in this back hood, which I'll show you in a little later. We have our smokestack in the back. Our sap entry point is actually this valve right here in this back corner. It's coming into this float box. This float box is actually regulating, allowing the sap to come in. These are mechanical. They have a little float valve that's in there that, as our sap in this back pan, what we call the flue pan or the back pan here, as this gets lower, it'll open up and allow sap from, if you have a tank up here that's feeding into this entry point, it'll allow sap in. And it'll go back and forth through some dividers in our flue, which means there's all these little channels, which I'll show you. And then it's going to go into our front pans, our finishing pans, or also called our syrup pan, because this is where most of the flavor is going to happen up front because this is not running as thick. Usually you're only going 2-3 inches deep in the front, so it can get really hot. Where else in the back pan, in our flue pan, it's more around a foot thick. It's still going to be boiling, but it's not going to be quite as hot. Where here, as this is getting close to that finished maple syrup, this float box in the front is regulating from the back pan, coming into the sap pan. So as water evaporates in the front pan, or we're drawing off finished maple syrup from this draw off point in the front, then it'll allow sap from the back pan through this float box and this float valve into these front pans, and this has a few dividers to draw off at this finish point here. This is a wood-fired evaporator. It's got a nice airtight door and arch firebox that's there. So the flue pan, as I mentioned, that's our back pan here. It has all these dividers. So instead of being this really giant big pan that's maybe a sap that's a foot deep and 2 or 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, instead it has all these channels that are about an inch wide, so that instead of, I like to use an analogy, instead of putting one big giant pot on your stove and waiting hours for that to get boiling, or really half an hour or more to boil, this is like putting a bunch of little skillets on your stove that are only an inch deep of water that are going to boil within a few minutes, because there's a lot more surface area for that water to be able to contact and heat and boil. So there's a lot of surface area that the heat is up through these channels and the sap's down in between. So these evaporators can heat up and boil really quickly. The wood ones might take 20-30 minutes, maybe a little bit more, maybe an hour to get to a real good rolling boil. On my big evaporator, it's fuel oil, so it's it can get up to heat a lot quicker, and it will hold a few hundred gallons in that evaporator, but it can be boiling in like 5 minutes, because it's holding a lot of liquid in there, but there's a lot of surface area to heat. So here's a picture of what's called a drop flue evaporator. So the flues go down. This would be sitting on top of the arch right across here. And then these flues actually drop down into the arch, into the firebox. And so the heat's traveling down through. These are more common on wood-fired evaporators. The heat's coming down across here and then out the back. And so it's kind of open up on top. It's going to be a little bit deeper up there and then drops down into these flues. Sometimes there's a combination of raised versus drop flue. On the right is actually the main picture I showed was a raised flue, and this is looking at the end of the raised flue. So in this case, it's these big kind of hollow pipes going through the upper part of the pan, so the heat has to go through all of these tubes before it comes out the stack in the back. And then other ways we can be more efficient in our evaporator is to preheat that sap. As I've mentioned before, instead of dumping cold sap into our boiling sap, if we can somehow preheat that. So as we, whether we have a pipe wrapped around the stack that's going to allow it to warm up, or up in the hood of our evaporators, we can have these preheaters that the sap's going to go back and forth and travel back and forth through all these tubes that are up in that hood above our boiling back pan. So all that steam that's coming up is going to build up around those tubes, and that can warm up. And so a lot of times these can get the sap to be about 160, 180 degrees before they actually drops down into that flue pan, which is really great if you think about, sap that was maybe only 35, 40 degrees, 45 beforehand, to get up to 160, 180 by just using the energy from that steam that's going up through our steam stacks out of our building anyway. So those really improve the efficiency, and it would sit up in this hood area. Another type is, we won't spend too much time on, but is steam away or piggybacks that are out there. They're fairly similar, except there's a little bit more going on, that there's some blowers that are actually pushing some of that air and hot steam through the sap that and that's in these trays, that allows it to actually get almost up to start to get sort of closer to a boil. So it gets a little bit hotter, and you actually get a little bit of concentration that's starting to happen a little bit in that. They're a little bit harder to clean, and they add more cost in there. But there are people that still use them. They are out there. So we think about areas that where we can improve efficiency when we're looking at evaporators. The biggest one is the stack temperature. You want to make sure that you're not losing too much of your heat going out to the stack. But you also want to make sure that you have a good hot roaring fire using a blower, oftentimes in a wood-fired evaporator to keep good air to get good complete combustion. So we don't typically want to be much over 500 degrees Fahrenheit going out of our stack. We want to make sure our arch or wood-fired arch or oil-fired or anything is insulated well, so it's airtight, so that our heat is going up into our pans and not out the sides, out the front door. Ways to improve, so complete combustion through the fans, as I mentioned, and then any type of steam recovery, so preheaters, steamaways that are gathering some of that steam and utilizing that. And so one thing I guess I didn't mention, just go back quick, that either these piggyback steamaways or even just a preheater, they have a tray. If you look at this upper left picture, these V kind of trays that actually sit below it, because that steam that's coming up is going to condensate around the pipes because that sap is colder, and so that's now back into a water. We don't want that dripping down into our sap again, and so it actually drips and it collects out and actually comes out a pipe out the side, and we can collect that and use that for cleaning machine equipment and things like that. So it's actually handy to have that nice hot fresh water. The steamaways produce a lot more, so for people who don't have good running water or don't have running water at all in their sugar house, the steamaway can be a way to actually generate water that can be used for cleaning equipment at the end of the day. So I want to pause there for any questions. So feel free to throw any questions in the chat. And think about, what's your method for boiling? Are you going to be using batch or continuous? If you want to, feel free to jump in and even say what you're planning to use. See, there's a question from Ken. Is there a concern for copper ions leaching into sap from copper pipe, preheaters, etc.? Copper is used less nowadays, but there doesn't seem to be a big concern from the copper getting into the sap. So from everything that I've read or heard, that it's still okay. There's not a concern with copper right now, but it's typically not used quite as much as it used to be. It's a good question, though. All right, so just to kind of wrap up evaporators, boiling our sap a little bit on the evaporator side of things, and we're going back to what fuel should we actually be using, and that's really a personal decision on what you want to do. Wood is great. It's wonderful if we can take woods from our forest and be burning that versus using fossil fuels. If we want to be more kind of sustainable, especially if we have active, healthy growing forest. And if you're sustainably collecting that firewood, then your trees are going to be replenishing and taking in the carbon that you're burning off within that wood. So wood can be great, but wood adds a level of management in that it's a lot of work of cutting and stacking wood, or even if you're buying in firewood, when you're boiling, it's almost a full-time job that usually an evaporator needs wood to keep a good hot roaring fire going. You want to be adding wood every 5 to 7 minutes typically. So most people will have like a timer, set. So after they, add wood, they'll hit the timer again. So it'll count down for 7 minutes. Once the timer goes out, you need to add in more wood. And so we want to keep that good fire going. Another downside to wood is that, it takes a little bit longer to get it boiling, as I mentioned before, but also at the end of the day, what you don't want to do is you don't want to run out of sap and then say, all right, now I need to stop boiling, stop adding wood. You can't just shut it off. You usually need to figure out the timing of, all right, I still have a little bit of sap, but I'm almost out, so I'm going to stop adding wood. So because what you never want to do is you don't want your evaporator to evaporate everything down in the pans. There always needs to be something in the pans, or you're going to burn them and warp them. Some people say you don't become a true sugar maker until you've burned at least one pan. And so it does unfortunately happen, but you don't want that to fully empty. So there should always still be something in your evaporator. So I guess this is something that people don't always mention if you're not familiar with evaporators, that we don't cook it all the way empty at the end of the day. When we're out at the end of the day, we shut off, and there's still this kind of gradient of it's been got to a boil, so it's been sterilized, so it can stay a few days, especially if the weather is cool. It can stay even longer, because it has got to a boiling temperature, so it's at least sterilized it a little bit. Um, so it'll still be, mostly sap still back there, and then gradually getting that gradient closer to syrup as we get to the front of the evaporator. But that's going to be there. So then if we the next day or 2 days, 3 days later, we fire up our evaporator again, the first syrup we're actually going to make is the what was left in there from the last time we were boiling. And so that's what we're going to draw off first. And so there's always stuff left in the pan. So when we get to the end of the day, if you're using wood fired, you're still going to have a hot fire for another hour or two. So you want to make sure you still have sap to slowly add back in, or you have to have a shovel handy to like try to scoop out the embers or the burning logs so that it doesn't, cook your sap all the way down and warp your pan. And so that's one drawback to wood. One other thing I want to, I guess, say about evaporators that people don't typically say is that sometimes if you're using these continuous flow evaporators, the first boil of the season is what's called sweetening the pans. And that's because, it's empty. So you fill it with all whatever your starting sap, whether it's raw sap or your concentrate from your reverse osmosis. And it's going to take a lot longer to get up to finished syrup. Whereas the next time when you go to boil, you had, you drew off some syrup or you were close to syrup. And so that's almost syrup there. So as soon as you start boiling, you're going to make syrup pretty quickly. But when you first start and it's only 4% sugar, or 2% if it's raw sap, you're going to have a lot of boiling. And sometimes your first 1 or 2 boils, you may not make any syrup because you're just concentrating it down, depending on the size of your evaporator and how much sap you have. You may just be sweetening the pan, just creating that gradient flow, before you can even start drying off. So that's something to mention as well. And so that's our wood fired. The nice thing about oil or gas is that it's an easy on off. So if there's any issues you need to stop in a boil, you can just turn it off instead of just waiting for that wood fire to burn out. At the end of the day, when you're tired, you want to go to bed, shut it off, it's done. You're not waiting for that wood to kind of fire to go out. Here's just a rough cost. Again, it's going to fluctuate. And we kind of looked at these when we looked at reverse osmosis, but the current cost per gallon of syrup, how much you're going to spend on wood versus more sealed woods, that can be your typically your cheaper option, but you need also that space for all that wood storage and the labor of moving it around, fuel oil, natural gas, propane. And this is on the more standard evaporator efficiencies. If we're talking about burning on a propane burner, turkey fryer burner in your backyard, that propane is going to be more around $60 per gallon of syrup. So definitely much higher because it's not very efficient. And just a note on wood that, it's important maybe to think about the species of wood that you're burning. That's going to impact your BTUs. There's lots of different theories though on what wood you want to use for maple, and depends on what part of the boil and different things. Everybody has kind of their own philosophy. It doesn't mean that you can't use softer woods that have lower BTUs, because it's a little bit different than maybe a wood stove in your house where you want a more of a low, a good hot fire, but a longer burn, where in maple we usually want just a real hot fire and we just keep adding wood. So it's usually a lot cheaper to get some of the lower BTU wood. But as long as we're there, we need more of it, but we keep adding it, we can burn through that really quick and it'll still get us a hot fire. Some people use slab wood from sawmills that they can get cheap or even free. Some people cut up old pallets and burn. I know some people have a theory of a mixture of some softwood and hardwood, where they want that hardwood that's going to have a nice hot long burn, and then some softwood that's going to take off quick and burn real hot real quickly. So that's some theory that people mix together species of wood when they're burning as well. The biggest, most important thing about wood, no matter what species you're working with, is making sure it's dry. So making sure that you have good seasoned wood that's dried for a year or two or more. That's going to be a lot more efficient. If you're burning green wood, it's very inefficient. You're not going to get to a good hot temperature. All right, any questions there? So when is it actually syrup? So when are we actually finishing it and drying it off? And so our goal, the standard that we need to be in Canada, and I made a typo there. I was actually adjusting this today and I made a typo. It should be 66.0% to 68.9, not 69.9. So 68.9%. That is the standard for most of the US states. There's actually two states in Vermont, or sorry, Vermont and New Hampshire, two states in the US that are 66.9, but most in the US and also in Canada, it's 66.0 to 68.9% sugar. And we can determine this with either a hydrometer, which is this glass tube you see in the left-hand side that's floating in the syrup. I'll go over this. We can use a thermometer, just a basic thermometer, doesn't have to be anything too fancy, or we can use a hydrometer. Hydrometers, I don't think I've mentioned these. This is what is used for typically more used for measuring the sugars within sap. So this on this blue part is the prism. There's a little clear plastic piece that you flip up. You can drop the sap or syrup on there, close it, and you look through it. And when you look through it, that's this picture on the right. It's this kind of analog gauge, and where that blue line is tells you the percent sugar. So in this case, looks like right around 10, so it'd be 10% sugar. So this would be more in concentrated sap. So when you're using reverse osmosis, you would measure with a refractometer. There's different scales. If you notice here, this goes from 0 to 20, so you cannot use that for syrup because it doesn't go high enough. You'd have to get a separate one that would be more of like a 30 to 70 or 80 or 50 to 80 that would do for actual syrups. This one's just for sap. So they can be used for syrup, but they're not great, especially with hot syrup. They're more for syrup at room temperature. So either a thermometer or a hydrometer are the best. And so our finished maple syrup at 66% sugar is going to finish at 7.1 degrees above the boiling point of water Fahrenheit, or 4 degrees Celsius above the boiling point of water. And the reason why I say the boiling point of water and not 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius is that our boiling point of water changes based on your elevation, changes on the atmospheric pressure each day. And it also, every thermometer are not completely accurate. You can go and buy, a $200 thermometer, but doesn't mean it's going to be perfectly right on. There can be some fluctuations that could be just as off as the $10 thermometer that you can also buy. And so this is really important because if you're off just a little bit, this can have some big impacts on the quality of your syrup, because if your syrup is below 66% sugar, that's too thin. The mouthfeel is going to be weird, but more importantly, it's also has a chance still of fermenting and spoiling. And so I've seen plastic jugs of maple syrup that have ballooned out because they weren't cooked to a high enough density. And so there's been a little bit of fermentation that's happened, and so they've expanded in those jugs, and so that's going to be off flavored. That's definitely not great. And also, as that density, if it's too thin, if somebody's pouring that onto their plate or whatever, it's going to be watery. They're not going to like that. If we get too high, if we get above 69% sugar in our syrup, it'll crystallize and form these rock candy crystals like are here. And so People don't want that. It's a little frustrating as a consumer. If you get that in the bottom, that's product that you're missing out on, or you're trying to eat that or melt it back down. This can, even if your density was done correctly in plastic jugs stored in a fridge over time, there can be evaporation of water in that plastic jug. And so you still can get that even if it was the correct density initially. And so then so thinking about our hydrometers are the best way, the most accurate oftentimes for measuring hot maple syrup coming off of our evaporator. The issue is on a small scale is it takes a lot of syrup just to fill the cup. And if you're not making a lot of syrup, you may not have enough syrup to fill that cup, or you may not want to pour it all in, and then some of it doesn't all get out. You're trying to scrape it out because you want to get every little single drop. So the hydrometer is based on density. So this glass tube has this weight on the bottom that is calibrated. So typically most of them, some of them are 66 degrees Brix, which is percent sugar, or some of them are 66.0 at typically 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are calibrated that this little red line here, if it's the correct density, if it's 66.9% or 66.0, depending on the hydrometer that you have, that red line will float right at the surface, be based on the density. It's the correct density with that weight will float correctly. But the issue is when the syrup is warmer, it's going to be more viscous, and that density is going to be a little bit different. So as your syrup is warmer, above 60 degrees, it's actually going to, that hydrometer will sink down. So at 209 degrees Fahrenheit, that'll actually on the scale here would show 59 Brix, which would be off. And so the top red line is actually calibrated to be when you're at 211 degrees Fahrenheit. That top red line would actually be finished maple syrup floating there. So at more room temperature, the bottom red line, the top red line is for that hot syrup coming off your evaporator. And if you're anywhere in between where it's cooled, syrup's cooled down a little bit, then there's charts that will allow you to calculate based on the temperature. There's a calibration factor to add into that to read your hydrometer. So you can adjust for that temperature. So just a couple pictures of that. Here's where it's floating with the hot test at 211 degrees Fahrenheit, hot maple syrup right off the evaporator, it's floating right at the surface. In this picture, it's a little bit dense. That red lines up with this hot syrup off the evaporator. It's actually floating a little bit higher, so it's a little bit too dense. So we need to just draw off some syrup that's a little bit lighter. This picture on the left, that's too dense. That red line's floating above. But if this was room temperature syrup, that you can't quite see the red line and the bottom red line, so then that's too thin. So it's important to look at those charts and know the temperature. And so when we're drawing off syrup, there's two different methods. The most common is the manual. If we're doing it in small evaporators, there's a little more guesswork involved. And takes you get a little bit better just knowing kind of the timing. So you're just drawing off some samples every now and then and checking it. If it's not thick enough, throw it back in. If it's too heavy, draw off some thinner maple syrup to add with it. Bigger operations are using these automatic kind of draw off units I'll show you a picture of. So in these small manual draw off units, you got a little ball valve and a collection bucket you're going to draw off. Now, whether you're going to draw it off as finished maple syrup or a little bit thin and then finish it separately can be an option for this. Sometimes these evaporators will have a little built-in spot where a thermometer that's right kind of next to your finishing point where you're drawing off. And a lot of times they'll start at 0 is actually not 0 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit. 0 is actually the boiling point, and then you can see they go up, so 0 to 7, so that they you can kind of fine tune and look at the lines a little bit carefully. So it's really not until it's boiling, it's not even going to start to register on this thermometer. You can typically adjust these. They usually have adjustment screws to set them to the boiling point of water. It's really good to but all you really need is even just a simple thermometer. But the best thing to do each day is to just on a stovetop boil a little bit of tiny pot of water and measure what's the temperature of that with that thermometer that you're using. It really doesn't matter what the boiling point of water is based on your elevation, the atmospheric pressure. It's based on what your thermometer is actually reading. Because again, thermometers can not always be perfect. So measure or boil a little bit of water, put a thermometer in, figure out what that boiling temperature is. And then if you're using Fahrenheit, add around 7 degrees to that, 7.5 degrees. If you want a little bit denser, if you're using Celsius, add 4.25, 4.5 degrees to that. I don't recommend these glass tube candy thermometers that you can buy at supermarkets, mostly because when it's boiling, they steam up and you can't read them. And it's also really, really fine lines. And there's a bunch of other stuff and like for candy making, hardball and the softball and stuff that's on there that makes it really hard to read. These digital thermometers, you can actually buy some pretty cheap ones, and they have a quick reaction. I've been really happy with those. These automatic draw-off systems that larger operations are using have a temperature probe that go in kind of where the analog gauge was. It has one that screws in instead. It's measuring the temperature. You still use a hydrometer, or you could, I guess, measure the boiling point, but a lot of times people are still using a hydrometer to figure out where that syrup is finishing. And then they can adjust the set point of where maple syrup is finishing. And then when the temperature reads that set point, it'll tell this ball valve to open up on its own. It'll draw off the syrup. Once it cools down, what's coming through is that continuous flow. It'll close and wait till that to heat back up. So those, they take a little bit of the guesswork out. You still have to do some checking and spot checking it every now and then, but it does help. As maple sap is cooking, it oftentimes foams up, especially in the initial part of first starting up your boiling. When it's getting up to a good rolling boil, it'll start to foam up. So we use a defoamer. So from your maple supply companies, you can buy these commercial defoamers. You only usually need 1 or 2 drops, and every so often throughout the boil, if it's getting foaming up a little bit, you add those so it doesn't foam up over. Make sure that you're using a food grade defoaming agent. People used to use bacon grease and things like that. I don't recommend that just from a food safety and allergen standpoint. Don't use peanut oils. That could be some food allergen issues. This is one of the big differences. If you're a certified organic maple operation, that your defoamer needs to be a certified organic defoaming agent. There are some commercial ones out there, but a lot of people are using just a organic cooking oil. Saffron oil is the most common, I believe, that's used for organic producers. And when we're cooking down, we're drawing off our finished maple syrup, and that if you'll see is that your maple syrup is usually cloudy. And this is because there's what's called sugar sand or niter that's forming, and that's minerals that have precipitated out of the sap while you're cooking it. And sometimes these will actually form these larger kind of chunks and pieces, as you can see in these couple pictures, that'll get in the bottom of your pans. Doesn't always get that unless you're making a lot of syrup. You won't get that as much, but you'll at least get some cloudiness. And then as that syrup sits over time, that cloudiness will settle into the bottom of your syrup. It's not going to look as clean. It's not going to be as nice. And also your customer is not going to get as much product. So you're required by law to filter your maple syrup if you're going to be selling it. If you're using it at home, you don't have to worry about it. You just pour from the top, and as you get to the bottom, any of the minerals that are left behind, you can just dump those then once you've drawn off all of the syrup. It's not going to hurt you. It's just minerals. If anything, it's probably good for you. But if you're selling it, it's not as clean. It's not as good. Your customer is not getting as much product. So you want good, clean, filtered syrup if you're going to be selling it. So different ways to filter maple syrup. When it comes off the evaporator, one way is to use these kind of filter presses, commercial filtering units, or another way is to use a felt filter and using gravity to just let it pass through. In smaller producers and kind of these batcher methods, it's harder to filter maple syrup at smaller scales levels through these paper felt filters, but it does work. The biggest thing is make sure it's good and hot when you're passing that through. You can stack up several layers of filters, because one of the issues with these felt filters is that you dump all your syrup there, and it filters through a quarter of it or half of it, but then all the niter kind of settles and plugs up the filter, and it won't kind of go through, or it's going through really, really slow. And so you can sometimes stack a few felt filters on top, and then as that plugs up, you can kind of slide that one out and let the syrup dump out onto the layer below, and what was plugged up with the niter will stay in that filter. And so that's one way to go through it. I don't recommend coffee filters. They really don't work very well for filtering syrup. The felt filters are the best for doing that. Then there are these, obviously, the filter presses. Usually these have some kind of pump mechanism, whether it's a little pneumatic kind of hand pump, diaphragm pump on the picture on the right, or an actual air-powered diaphragm pump or gear pump that's pushing that sap through. These filter presses, they have all these plates, and in between each of these plates, there's a little paper filter that goes through that syrup is pushing through. And when we filter maple syrup with these filter presses, we use what's called filter aid, which is DE, diatomaceous earth. It's used in a lot of food industry filtering. Diatomaceous earth, this is fossilized little single cell protist diatoms that when you look at them under a microscope, they look kind of like broken up sand dollars. They have all these little micropores. And so what happens is when we let me back up. We take this filter aid, we mix it in actually to our finished hot maple syrup, and we stir it around. And then we pump that syrup through our filter press. And what happens is all this syrup, or the diatomaceous earth, is blocked by the filter papers and builds a layer or a cake up against that filter. And then the syrup actually has to push through all those little micropores and creates an even finer filtration. And these little kind of broken up pieces also help break the surface tension, so that syrup goes through and leaves all the niter, the sugar sand behind. For diatomaceous earth, it's really important that we use a food grade. Don't use because diatomaceous earth is used as a garden in gardens to kill like slugs and other pests like that. There's even swimming pool diatomaceous earth, so make sure it's a food grade diatomaceous earth. And just last thing I want to finish up on is kind of some filtering rules. Be really careful with like felt filters, paper filters, where you're storing them. Make sure they're not in any containers that have any odd scents or smells that are getting in there. Don't put mothballs in. You even really don't want to use an airtight container where it's going to get stagnant. Make sure you clean those filters thoroughly, though. Don't put them away dirty. Don't put them away wet. Make sure that they dry, the air dry out completely. Don't use any chlorine or detergents on there. That's going to stay in that. So make sure you just clean it with water. It's actually best to, and even new filters, you want to do this, is to soak them in boiling water and then let them air dry out in the sun is best, so that they really get dry quick. Don't want to put them in your dryer with some clothes and your dryer sheets or anything like that that'll give any fragrance. The best thing is always use the sniff test. The worst thing you want to do is do all that work and then take your finished hot maple syrup and put it through a nasty smelling filter that's going to make your maple syrup smell nasty. So do the sniff test, make sure it smells okay. And we always want to filter our maple syrup hot because it's going to go through a lot quicker. Do it right after you do the boiling, finishing off. And just the last thing I'll finish here is a small scale hobby option is to do this vacuum filter, where you actually hook a shop vac up to this pipe underneath. And then this sits down over top, and you can put a felt and paper filter here. You can do one or both. and then that actually helps pull the syrup down through and sucks it down. So this is kind of a cheaper homemade. Actually, a small producer near me made this one. So it helps suck it down through. You can even use a little diatomaceous earth. So it's much cheaper than buying a big filter press, and works well for small scale and a little bit better than just a felt filter, just gravity passing through. This is a real simple one that my coworker actually made, and we actually use a little vacuum pump and to create vacuum in this chamber, and then do a quick suction, and it pulls down through the bottom of this pan, has a hole in it. Then it goes down through this felt filter. And then we can actually bottle right out of there at that bottom one. And it does a really good job of creating some clean maple syrup. So we'll finish there for the day. I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A time. So feel free to add any more into the box or unmute yourself. I see there's a couple in there. There's a question from somebody saying alder is a no-no and an evaporator question mark. I know in common wood stove it's not recommended. Alder, I don't know for sure, but I think alder would probably be fine. Usually like fir, balsam fir and spruce is usually kind of a no, not recommended in your home wood stoves. But that's typically fine in a wood-fired evaporator because we're keeping it's a little bit different. We're not dampening it down, we're keeping a lot of air to it, so it's going to burn off, and you usually don't have the creosote issues in the wood stack. Those issues are usually more of like creosote building up in the chimney in your house. But because we're creating such a hot roaring fire, that's burning a lot of that stuff through, that's typically not an issue as you have with some of the woods that you typically wouldn't burn in your home wood stove that you can burn in an evaporator. But if you're concerned about it, then don't do it. Steve asked, do you have a comparable chart that shows volume of dry wood and cords? 120 cubic feet requires per gallon versus money per gallon. Unfortunately, I don't think that I do, and I'm not as familiar with a chart that's out there that shows kind of the dry, the cords of wood that's required per gallon of syrup. And the money, and looking at that, there's a lot of variables that go into it in each evaporator. And so unfortunately there's not any good charts out there on that right now. If that answers your question. Unfortunately, I guess it doesn't, but any other questions? It's a question from Andrew. On average, what is the longest you can store sap outside after harvesting? That's a great question. And I get that question actually quite a bit. It's a tough question because there's not a perfect answer to that question, because it really depends on the temperature, of what's the temperature outside. Later in the season, you're typically dealing with warmer weather. The last quarter of your season, you usually don't want sap to probably sit outside more than 2-3 days, because that season's a little bit warmer, the micro populations build up more in your tanks and buckets or whatever, anything like that. So after 2, 3, 4 days, that's probably not going to be good, but it's going to depend on what the temperature of the outside is, and of that sap, how quickly it was collected and gotten to a cooler area, wasn't kept in the sun, all that. You don't want tanks or buckets kept out in the sun where it's going to heat up more. Earlier in your season, you might be able to keep sap a week if it's cooler, and not if it's not getting warm every day, if you're not getting sap flows every single day. You can keep sap. Last year we had some sap flow in mid-February. We got a thaw in mid-February, and then we boiled, but then we still had some sap. We had, it got cold again, then it warmed up a little bit a week later. We collected some sap, but not enough to boil. And then it got cold, and we didn't get sap flow for like another month. And so we had sap that sat a month. We had a little bit of ice. It didn't freeze solid. We had a little bit of ice because it was actually inside. It's not a heated space though, but it got cold enough that there was a little bit of ice. So it kept it, but it didn't spoil because it was cold enough. So it really just depends on that temperature. So I guess my biggest recommendation is just kind of look at the sap. That takes some experience of just knowing of how long based on the weather conditions. But the best thing is if you can keep that sap as cool as possible. So out of the sun, if you can get it into a, if you have a small quantity that you can move around and put it into a, a garage or a basement or something where it might be a little bit colder, or I think I might have mentioned last time, or maybe I didn't, of, if you've got a snowbank that you can put it into. So I recommend, the wintertime to pile up some snow somewhere on the north or east side of a garage or barn so that it doesn't get the sun as quickly and won't melt as quick. And then you can kind of store buckets of sap in there if need be. So, any other questions for tonight?
Okay. I don't see any others popping up, so I think we'll end for the night. But I want to thank Adam again for putting on this webinar. And the fourth and final webinar in the Introduction to Maple Syrup Production series will be this Wednesday, November 15th at the same